And welcome. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson Institute. Welcome to the Betsy and Walter Stern Conference Center here at Hudson Institute for what is a very exciting event on the Global Magnitsky Act, Ending Impunity for Human Rights Abusers. Very shortly, we're going to have a very interesting discussion featuring Bill Browder, the author of Red Notice, A True Story of High Finance Murder and One Man's Fight for Justice, which is an incredible read, and the book is gripping. Bill is a man of immense moral courage, and I had the honor of just a couple hours ago testifying alongside him before the House International Affairs Committee on the Global Magnitsky Act, and it was fun seeing him in action there. It'll be even more fun this evening, and he'll be in discussion with Charles Davidson, the executive director of Hudson's new kleptocracy initiative, and Kyle Parker, who is a staff member at the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Hudson is an American think tank dedicated to strong and engaged U.S. international leadership in partnership with our allies, defending human rights, defending the rule of law. It's some of the most crucial work that we do as an organization. As part of that effort, this year we founded a new initiative, the Kleptocracy Initiative, which is an effort that is aimed at addressing the threats posed by corrupt authoritarian regimes to Western democracy and U.S. national security, a threat that is posed by the growing financial leverage that kleptocrats and their allies have on the economies of the West, and also at times on the politics of the West. As we've seen in political financing, particularly from Russia, other countries as well, in both East and Western Europe, posing a threat to democracy, rule of law, and democratic accountability. Given the threat that these kleptocracies pose to democracy in their own countries and to the defense of freedom abroad, we created this initiative to highlight this important issue. And we're very fortunate that Charles Davidson, who is also the publisher of the wonderful review, The American Interest, is the executive director of this initiative with us, and it's my honor to turn the floor over to him.
Well, thank you, Ken. You did introduce the Kleptocracy Initiative for me. Thanks. So I don't have to do that now. That's great. So I will just briefly introduce Bill Browder and Kyle Parker. And we have such a distinguished audience here that we decided we're going to be relatively brief, so Bill will speak and Kyle will counterpoint a little bit, and then we're actually going to move to Q&A fairly quickly in about half an hour. So introducing Bill Browder is very easy and always a pleasure. I had the honor of interviewing him twice for the American Interest magazine. That was great. And it's always very refreshing for me to deal with a business person as opposed to all these political types, because I used to be a business person, and it's just so straightforward and easy. So that was nice. Bill is on the advisory council of the Kleptocracy Initiative and has been hugely supportive of the initiative from the start, instrumental in our current name, because we had a very sort of hard to remember name. It was the Financial Corruption and Autocracy Initiative, something like that. Anyway, and Bill was exasperated one day at one of our meetings and said he's been talking to everybody about the Kleptocracy Initiative, and it's such a great thing, but he can never remember the name of it. And we actually started out with the code name, the Anti-Kleptocracy Initiative. And then we figured that the anti was perhaps not really needed. Although there's a lot of Putin money in this town. And I was at a different think tank, not the Hudson Institute, but a different think tank. And somebody asked me, based on my business card, whether I was in favor of kleptocracy or against it. I can't remember exactly how they put it. And I told them that no one had offered me enough money yet to be in favor of it. And they took that very seriously. It seemed like a reasonable answer to them. So now we have Congressman McGovern, who has just joined us. So actually, I think Bill could introduce Congressman McGovern, and then perhaps, Congressman, you'd like to say a few words first about Global Magnitsky, and we'll take it from there.
Should we just sit down? You want to sit? You want to do ours? Let's just sit. So I'm going to talk a little bit later, but when I came to Washington to fight for justice for Sergei Magnitsky, I didn't know that much about how one does things in Washington. And I was invited by the Tom Lantos Human Rights Subcommittee, of which Congressman McGovern is chairman, in the summer of 2010 to testify about what was going on in Russia. And I came to his committee, and I came actually unprepared. I didn't know you were supposed to write up a testimony and then read off of it and have statistics and analysis. I just thought you were supposed to talk, and so I came and talked. And I came and I told the story of Sergei Magnitsky, not with any statistics or anything prepared, but just the human story of this young man who tried to do the right thing and who was then tortured and murdered by his government for trying to do the right thing. And at the end of my testimony, the one thing I did know is you're supposed to ask for something, and so I said, could you support our efforts in calling on the State Department to do something about this? And Congressman McGovern said, why should we call on the State Department? We make laws in Congress. And he was the one who then initiated the Sergei Magnitsky Act, which has become one of the most important pieces of human rights legislation that's happened in the last few decades. And what I've learned since then is that Congressman McGovern is involved in almost every piece of anything to do with human rights. His name is on it, whether it has to do with going after Joseph Kony or just about anything that there is going on in Congress to do with human rights. He's the man. He's kind of the dean of human rights in Washington, and he's also the author of the global Sergei Magnitsky Act, and a very successful politician from Massachusetts and a good friend, and I'm glad that he's here to continue to support our efforts and to be moving this process forward.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here, but Bill Browder and Cal Parker really are the experts on all this stuff, so I'm going to be very, very brief. But I hope everybody here has read Bill's book, Red Notice. It is a page turner. It is like one of the most suspenseful books that I think I've ever read, but it's all true. It makes you realize just how cruel some people can be, and the terrible plight of Sergei Magnitsky. It's a heartbreaking story, but people ought to read it. They ought to understand, what human rights defenders go through and what they're subjected to. In this case, unfortunately, Sergei Magnitsky was murdered by Russian authorities. But kind of the whole the impetus behind the bill originally, when Bill and Kyle first came to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, was the view that people who do terrible things ought to face a consequence. And what do you do when you have a country that has a lot of people in its government that do terrible things to other people, but there's no rule of law in that country? There's no way to get justice in that country. And then to kind of complicate things further is that, in this case, Russia and the United States have a kind of a very complicated relationship. And there's this tendency to not want to further complicate it by going after individuals who, quite frankly, deserve to be sought after and deserve to be pointed out for their terrible actions. And we thought that this was one way to hold human rights abusers and people who are guilty of corruption accountable. It's not a substitute for a judicial system in Russia that works. But it's something. And what bothered me, and again, why we're all here for this global Magnitsky bill, is that there are too many countries where people get away with things, where there's no consequence to violating others' human rights, and there ought to be. And we were all kind of tired of sending letters and issuing statements, and going through kind of the usual stuff you all go through every time there's a country that where somebody's rights are being abused, and then nothing ever happens, but you can feel good that you at least raised your voice. And so we thought that this was an appropriate step. And what makes it unique is it goes after the individuals. So this is not the Magnitsky Act was never anti-Russia. It was anti-bad guys in Russia. It was against those who commit human rights violations, those who rip off their citizens and who are guilty of corruption. And so we're not talking about massive sanctions against the country of Russia. We're talking about making it clear to those individuals and others who might follow in their footsteps that if you do something like this, if you murder somebody, if you steal money, if you're a human rights violator, then you're not going to be welcome in the United States, that you're going to be put on a list and your assets are going to be frozen. You can't hide all the money you steal in U.S. banks. And that, of course, has implication with other countries as well, in terms of how these individuals are treated. And we'd like the rest of the world to kind of follow suit. But it makes sense, I think, for Russia, but it makes sense globally. And so Congressman Chris Smith, is taking the lead this time on the global Magnitsky bill, and I, are trying to kind of finish what we started. Just one final point, we almost had a global Magnitsky bill. That was kind of the original intent. But in the back and forth and compromises and issues about costs and on and on and on, it was kind of whittled down. I think we want to go back to what it was originally intended to be, and that is, a global bill. And so I'm optimistic that we're going to see things move. There's great bipartisan support, just as there was on the original Magnitsky bill. I mean, you had liberals like me from Massachusetts working with conservatives like John McCain, and then you had people like Ben Cardin and very conservative members, of the House and Senate, all kind of coming together around this. And but I think it's the right thing to do. And I've always felt that if the United States of America stands for anything, we ought to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. And this is a consequence. This is a response that means something. And so I'm looking forward to working with the team up here to making sure that this becomes law, and hopefully we will move it quickly, and we can then celebrate a great victory for human rights. So thank you.
Right, thank you. So let me just spend a few minutes. I think it's be more interesting to have a conversation than me just talk at you. But as I look out in the audience, I see, I think about half the audience somehow participated one way or another in this exercise to get the Magnitsky Act passed. I mean, I see so many friends and supporters. This is almost like if the Russians wanted to.
Don't give many ideas.
It's being live streamed, so.
And it's not just the Russians anymore either.
I thought maybe I would just tell the story. A lot of you played a role in different parts of the story, but maybe I just tell the story in a very abbreviated form of how the Magnitsky Act came about and how the global Magnitsky Act is now sort of blossoming from that, just to fill in the narrative for everybody so they have it in their heads. And since I know most of you, I'm not going to give you the whole background story. I'm going to start from the middle. So as you probably know, Sergei Magnitsky was my lawyer. As my lawyer, he had my offices had been raided by the Moscow police, and they seized all of our documents, and then they used those documents to perpetrate a massive fraud, not against me, but against the Russian government, where they stole $230 million. And Sergei Magnitsky was an idealistic young man. He was 36 at the time, and he was also a very sort of black and white law, good and bad, law and order type of person. And he said that we shouldn't allow these officials to steal money from my country, and he was adamant that we should expose them. And we also were all under the impression that Vladimir Putin was a nationalist. We thought that he might be a bad guy, he might be a liar, he might be a lot of things, but we thought he was a nationalist, and he might have allowed people to steal money from me, but this wasn't my money that was stolen. This was the Russian government's money. And so we thought that if we filed criminal complaints with all the different law enforcement agencies of Russia, and we publicized this massive fraud against the Russian government, and if Sergei testified against the people involved, the good guys would get the bad guys, and that would be the end of the story. And so we did all that, and we discovered that in the Putin regime, there are no good guys, only bad guys. And instead of going after the people who committed this massive financial fraud against the government, the authorities went after Sergei Magnitsky. And on November 24th, 2008, at 8 in the morning, in front of his wife and 2 children, the same people he testified against came to his home, arrested him, put him in pretrial detention, where he was then tortured to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds, and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. And they did all this because they wanted him to withdraw his testimony, and they wanted him to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million. And nobody ever knows how they would behave under this type of duress. I don't know how I would behave. Sergei wouldn't have known how he would have behaved in advance. But when he was faced with an incredible, terrible choice between bearing false witness and perjuring himself on one hand, or not being tortured on the other, for him the emotional pain of lying and destroying his own credibility was more painful than the physical pain he had been put under, and he refused to sign their confession. And his conditions got worse and worse, and after 6 months he got very sick. He lost 40 pounds. He was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation. And 1 week before the operation was due, they came to him again with this false confession that they wanted him to sign. He refused, and then they abruptly moved him to a prison without medical facilities. And at this new prison without medical facilities, his health completely broke down. He went into constant agonizing pain. He was refused all medical treatment, and he eventually went into critical condition on the night of November 16th. On that night, they then moved him back to a prison with a hospital, but instead of treating him, they put him in an isolation cell, chained him to a bed, and then 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him until he died at the age of 37. And I got the news on the next day, and it was by far the most painful, life-changing, traumatic experience, news, communications that I could have ever gotten. And I couldn't carry on life the way I lived it before. There was no way I could go on just being a regular businessman. For me, the only thing that I could do at that point was to take my time, energy, and resources and devote it towards getting justice for Sergei Magnitsky, which is what I've done for the last 5.5 years. And Sergei, as many of you know, wrote everything down. He wrote down everything that happened to him in the form of 450 complaints that he filed during his 358 days in detention. And those documents should have led to the prosecution of a number of people for torture and murder. But the Russian government refused to acknowledge that anyone did anything wrong, and they exonerated every single person involved. They gave promotions and state honors to some of the most complicit. And it became obvious to me that we needed to get justice outside of Russia if we were going to get any justice at all. And so I started looking for justice. And I discovered something very demoralizing. I'm not a lawyer, and I sort of thought that in my mind that justice should have been possible. And there is no mechanism to get justice in a situation like this. It just doesn't exist. The best that one can do is, as Congressman McGovern said, is you can go and ask a politician that you know to write a letter. And then maybe if that letter has some impact on the government, then maybe the government will bring up the case. But it has no impact on anything else. And that I just couldn't live with that. And so as I looked at what I could do in this situation, it seemed to me that the one thing that was obvious about this crime was that this crime was about money. It was about the theft of $230 million. And it was about the murdering of the guy who uncovered that theft. And the people who steal that kind of money in Russia don't like to keep it in Russia because as easily as they stole it, it could be stolen from them. And so for all the, and they like to enjoy property rights and rule of law when they have that kind of money. And they like to keep their money in the West. They like to keep it in London and Switzerland and New York. They like to send their kids to school in the West. They like to send their wives and girlfriends on shopping trips to the West. And so we had, there's something that we have some ability to influence. And so when I brought that to Congressman McGovern's committee, light bulb went off, and that became the idea of taking those privileges away from these people became something which I would define as the new technology for fighting human rights abuses in Russia and ultimately in the West. And it became clear that we were onto something. It was sort of intuitively obvious to us that we were onto something just based on the concept, but it became clear in the Russians' reaction to this. So they would send FSB officers to every hearing and every lecture that I ever gave on this subject. Putin declared it his single most important foreign policy objective with America to stop the Magnitsky sanctions. They were just absolutely terrified, and we also this was reinforced when various Russian opposition leaders came to Washington, and Boris Nemtsov was one of the most outspoken supporters of the Magnitsky Act in Washington, in Brussels, and various other places. And he came here and said, if you've found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. They like to do their terrible crimes at home, and then they like to enjoy the fruits of the West. And if you take this away from them, and there's another person who's so he was murdered on the 27th of February for his opposition and perhaps for his endorsement of the Magnitsky Act. And Natalia Pelavine, who's also a human rights supporter, has just been arrested. She's not allowed to leave the country. She's supposed to be coming here tomorrow to testify or to give a speech at the Nemtsov Memorial. I'm going to take her place. And so we're on to something. It's obvious that this is something that the Russians care about, and it's obvious that everybody cares about it. This may not have been the 25 or 30 years ago. This may not have been the technology that worked. The Khmer Rouge didn't go on vacation to Saint-Tropez, but the Uzbek regime does. And so we're onto something much bigger than just one case or one country, and that's the beauty of the global Magnitsky Act. And I'm here in Washington this week. I just testified at the House Subcommittee on Human Rights in front of Chris Smith and his co-committee chairman, or co-committee members, and we're hopefully going to move this quickly and through the House and the Senate, and it will become a piece of legislation which will honor Sergei Magnitsky's sacrifice and make sure that his death wasn't a meaningless death. Kyle?
Well, thanks. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Congressman. Thank you,
Actually,
Charles.
let me say one thing, that Kyle Parker is a modest man. He's featured in my book. There's 2 chapters on him in my book. There's a chapter called Kyle Parker's War, and if you've ever seen the movie or read the book Charlie Wilson's War, it's basically Kyle Parker is the if it hadn't been for Kyle Parker, the Magnitsky Act wouldn't have ever become law. He basically worked 24/7 for 3 years, blocking and tackling and working his way through every different dysfunction of Washington to make sure that this was a law that came into existence. And he will have a place in history for the work that he did on the Magnitsky Act.
Well, thank you, Bill. Me and about half of this room over the past, 4 or 5 years. But thank you nonetheless. It's great to be here with so many friends and on this panel and here at Hudson. And thank you, Charles, for the invitation. Let's start with Bill's book. First, a plug as to how readable it is. I have a 13-year-old daughter who had come to know Bill as a voice on the telephone, calling and interrupting Thanksgiving dinners or whatever was going on. It's Bill from London, and usually it was whispers and, well, we can't speak about this yet. And that was the time, particularly when you had called me and told me about Alexander Petropavlichny's death. So serious stuff. But anyway, my daughter had come to know the story, and when the book came out, she said, "Oh, I want to get the book." And Bill sent me an advance copy, and I said, "Well, you just can't lose it because it's not out yet." And she read it in a few days. She had only 2 questions at the end of the book. She said, one, what is a G8? Well, that's a good question. We call it the G7 now, but remember the time when President Clinton went to Denver and wanted to, the other question she had was, why didn't you help in the first place? And sort of that's, a few words about how I got involved. Bill had been, as many of all of us know, had been coming around various capitals after having mysteriously lost his visa to Russia, having been the largest foreign portfolio investor, and something of a champion of some of the economic reforms that had taken place in the early Putin era. So it was rather surprising that he had been bounced from the country and was looking to restore his visa. And so when I was getting these emails, "Hey, can you meet with Bill?" I was sort of blowing him off and busy with other things and didn't want to take the meeting, didn't see how we necessarily could fit in. Visas were privileges after all. It was hard, particularly in a situation where the United States denies so many visas and often doesn't give an explanation, or maybe never gives an explanation. So finally we met on the third occasion, and this was early 2009, I think it was February. So Sergei Magnitsky was in prison at the time. And I began the meeting, said, "Bill, we can't help you with your visa. I'm glad you're here. I'd love to, hear what you think about what's going on in the Russian market and, tell us a few good stories." And he said, "Listen, that's not what I'm here for. Can you just hear me out?" And he told, for the first time in Washington, the story of Sergei Magnitsky. At the time, it hadn't ended, and in some sense, because we're here talking about globalizing this, his legacy still hasn't ended. And I was so impressed by it. My only reaction at the time was simply, "Could you tell that story again?" I told it again, and I thought it was just something so incredible that, and so different from the paradigm we had been used to experiencing with Russia. That one businessman was fighting another businessman, somebody's money was lost, and perhaps there were real issues of the rule of law, but ultimately it was a stake of money and property rights, business rights, and here I was at the time at the Helsinki Commission, Human Rights Commission, sort of feeling like not to say that we didn't have a role, but this was an entirely different story. I heard the story of what to me really struck me as, in a sense, the anti-Pavlik Morozov, right? I mean, there's this, for those of you who aren't familiar with Russian folklore in early Soviet period, there was this hero, a boy, and the story's become a little more controversial even lately. There's some various history on what parts of it were true, but there was this boy who was extolled by the Soviet authorities for having turned in his parents, essentially in the Stalinist era. And every park you went to, there was a statue of Pavlik Morozov. I mean, just a really brutal reality of how that would be held up as a model. And in the story of Sergei Magnitsky, I see this young Russian, this in a sense, a product of what we had hoped for and thought the Medvedev era, the modernization, and all this talk about anti-corruption would have been about, right? A simple, everyman Russian laboring in the vineyards, coming into the office with his coffee. This was someone who not only did he work for Bill, but had a number of other clients, including small NGOs, auditing their books and doing that work. He wasn't, a bullhorn-toting protester, wasn't even really a human rights activist. He's simply someone who was doing their job with integrity. And to me, the power of his story at a time when we were seeing such dark clouds on the horizon in terms of corruption, the rule of law, Russia, which really feel like this Sergei Magnitsky is really not just a hero for modern Russia, he is the hero for modern Russia. In the sense of that his story needs to be more widely known, and so after hearing Bill out, I went about the business of being a jaded sort of Russia hand, trying to dig dirt on the story and find out what part of it wasn't true and how Bill was sucking us into a vendetta of one Kremlin faction against the other, or so where was the money or what was the story. And I went all over town and talking to government types and non-government types and Russians and others, and found that the story checked out. And not only did it check out, it was worse than Bill was describing it. We're saying, hey, you think this is bad? This is a medium-sized fraud, essentially, $230 million at the time. And so we got involved, and we eventually put Bill on the stand at a hearing called the Medvedev Thaw. Is it real? Will it last? It's chaired by Senator Ben Cardin. Bill told the story, and as far as I was concerned at the time, that was that. I covered a wide portfolio. There were other human rights cases to work on, and as the congressman had sent, I thought all we could do was write a letter, or ask that it put a case on the stand, or send something to the president and say, could you raise this case at this meeting? And then when we did that, I guess our work was done, right? What more can we do? We don't have any magic levers. We can't send in SEAL Team 6. And I had, and shortly after that, we had sent a letter up of our concerns, and I neglected to include the Magnitsky case in that because I felt we had just touched that base. So let's go and look at religious freedom or property rights or some other basket of issues and include that. And had heard from a friend that Bill was kind of upset, and I thought, well, how many people get to tell their story before Congress? And that was the last I thought about the story until I came into my office on the morning of November 17th, 2009. And our press secretary said, hey, did you hear about this? Isn't that the guy we heard about? And had gotten the news that Sergei Magnitsky had died in jail. And for me, it was really a clarifying moment of how I approached my own little cubicle and desk working for the U.S. government trying to monitor human rights, and thought that, this is going to change how we do human rights. This is going to change, and thinking that we're going to take this case and drive it, and not succumb to the illusion that somehow if we focus too much on one thing, that other things will be neglected, that we'll sweep it all up into this, and that one person, one case is enough. And as you said, Bill, and I think this is really the secret of your success in telling the story, is that it's not statistics. It's not the sort of the mind-numbing, depressing story of here's a graph of the decline of press freedom, or here's the story of the North, what's going on in the North Caucasus. Without hearing the story of the human face and the individual behind it, we're simply not moved. I hate to put it that way, but you go out of some of these meetings and think, boy, it sucks to be you. I'm glad I don't live there. I don't know what we can do. But when you hear the story of the individual, and so another thing just to mention, that summer, after you had spoken, Natalia Estemirova was assassinated in the North Caucasus. And for me, she was the first person I had known personally who met an assassin's bullet. I mean, I'd known of other cases, Galina Starovoytova and others, and so when Magnitsky dies in jail, there really is a feeling that we need to do more than simply send a press release and condemn this. Let me also make an observation that to me is so powerful about his story, and I suspect it's carried out in other countries where this human rights abuse in China and other cases. When you look at Magnitsky and the folks in Russia who had sort of worked for justice, on the anti-corruption beat, promoted his story, and you look at the people who stole from the Russian people, who knowingly opened false cases, who arrested Magnitsky, took him away from his wife and his two boys. They're almost the same age, right? And to me, that's sort of two Russias staring each other in the face. What changes and what has to change so that there's more Sergei Magnitskys and less Artyom Kuznetsovs and Pavel Karpovs. The other thing I wanted to sort of remark, you had mentioned about thinking Putin was a nationalist. I continue to go back to Alexei Navalny's wonderful notion that, in a sense, Russia's leadership, they're pro-Western and we're pro-Russian, right? They keep their money in the West. They rob and steal and abuse the human rights of the Russian people. And here we are, in the sense, working and concerned about human rights in Russia. So it really was motivated from a love and an esteem for Russia and her people and her culture. And occasionally that would be noticed. I remember we had a Track 2 delegation that was coming through the Russian embassy to see Senator Cardin. I was a little worried, and what are they going to tell him? What they told him was, they said, Senator, thank you for what you're doing. We understand you do it to us because you know we can do better. And to me, that was so right on. It was exactly what we were doing. It was because we want to see these countries take their place, in particularly Russia, and be that modern European power that it should be. And let me just close with a little story on the effectiveness of this approach. We had Pussy Riot through to see some senators a year or so back. I had the honor of escorting them around the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which was a lot of fun. I don't know how many people came up and said, hey, can I take a picture with the girls? I'm really a big fan. And they actually thought they were a rock group and thought that people listened to their music. So Senator Jeff Flake, in our meeting with Pussy Riot in the Senate Foreign Relations room, he asked him, he said, how effective is this approach? How effective are these personal sanctions? And they had a great answer. And without skipping a beat, they said it's effective at keeping the conversation alive. And to me, that's really what this is all about. This makes sure that those irritants in our relations with these countries, which are present anyway, shall never be invisible. That they will be visible as long as they are real, and that way we can deal with them. And if it causes others to accuse us of human rights violations, fine. The fact that they levy those accusations vindicates the very premise that human rights should be protected. And so we can discuss those things on the merits, ignoring any ill will or disingenuousness of anyone who might accuse us otherwise. But to me, that's the most powerful, is that this makes sure that these awkward issues that always need that extra push in a world where you have, competing interests and the fast pace of world events that are always trying to kick the can down the road and say, now's not really the time to bring this up. No, when you have a public list, when you say these things, they are going to be part of our relationship with other countries, and it's going to be an awkward part. Anyway, not for me.
All right. Well, before we open things up to this very distinguished audience, I think one thing that really stands out in terms of the passage of the Magnitsky Act is Sergei's story, and how and you all talked about there's a personalization there that made people want to vote for the bill and all. For global Magnitsky, do we have some cases lined up that are going to push people to want to vote for global? How is that going to be handled strategically in terms of the passage of the bill? And perhaps you'd all like to just say a few words about global Magnitsky and the strategy for getting the bill passed and what we should may expect there, and then we'll open things up to the audience.
Okay, basically, part of the reason we call it the Sergei Magnitsky the global Sergei Magnitsky Act is you need some. I mean, Sergei's face is still on the act. It's not going after Russia anymore. It's going after everybody. I mean, there are so many cases, and it's interesting because I go every year to the Oslo Freedom Forum, which is sort of the Davos of human rights advocacy, and I gave a speech about Sergei Magnitsky, and I was just swarmed afterwards with by victims in every country who were all saying, "How do we, I'm from Kazakhstan, and here's my story. How do we get a Magnitsky Act for Kazakhstan? How do we get one for Tibet? How do we get one for China, for Venezuela?" And it became so obvious that this is like something. There's stories everywhere, and it became so obvious that this is like there's just such demand for this. I don't think. I mean, I think in a certain way, the way that this is going to work is that all these different victim groups are going to fan out across Capitol Hill with theirs, and everyone's got their specific sympathizers, and we're going to end up with I can't imagine that there'll be that much opposition to this bill because of that. The only opposition I think from anybody is going to come from the various business groups that are going to say this is going to hurt business. But I can't imagine that with the, every different interest group having every different friend that there's going to be a lot of opposition to this thing.
Well, let me first say thanks to the Hudson Institute for doing this, and when I walked in here, I didn't look at everybody in the audience here, but I thank you for those of you in the audience here, and there are many of you here who worked on this, and I appreciate it because this is really this wouldn't have happened unless there was this incredible collaboration. And look, I serve as co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Almost every week we do a hearing on human rights challenges in countries all around the world, and the most effective meetings and hearings that we have, I think, are the ones in which people tell personal stories. I mean, we are deluged with facts and figures and statistics, and I think, for a lot of people in Congress, they're so overwhelmed with all of those facts and figures and statistics that they don't feel them. While they can say that they're terrible, when you hear about individual cases, I think people are moved, and there's no shortage of individual cases. Whether we're talking about Russia or Bahrain or Venezuela, or I go right down the list of countries where human rights defenders are routinely denied their rights. They are brutalized, they are tortured, they are killed. Where that you have people who are government officials or working with the government who are ripping off the citizens of their country. Look, I think there'll be lots of people advocating for things, but I think if you do a global Magnitsky, I think the signal is this, that the Magnitsky Act that's in place for Russia right now, the administration is moving, not as dramatically as I would like, or think they should, but nonetheless, they are naming names. They are reviewing names that are going in, and I think that's a signal to other countries that, hey, maybe the United States is serious about this. Maybe there might be some consequences to some of the actions that are taken in our country. So I think I really do believe that once we get it through the committee process, and Chris Smith is going to lead us through the committee process, I don't think we're going to have a problem on the House floor, and I don't think you'd have a problem in the Senate chamber either.
Well, this is good news. Before we open it up to the audience, I mean, I'm just struck in these times of political cynicism at the bipartisan success of Magnitsky, and I hope soon global Magnitsky, and also we see how non-cynical individuals can accomplish great things, and so it's a very this whole business is extremely inspiring. And I think that's actually when global Magnitsky is passed, it'll be very interesting to see the way it is used, and that's a whole other subject. And I'm sure there'll be lots of cynicism in the foreign policy community about this, and it doesn't fit into our theories terribly well to go after individuals like this. And so Bill's analogy of it being the iPad of human rights is kind of perhaps appropriate. It's certainly innovative and something new, and something that hasn't come out of any of the think tanks or political thinkers, but from practical people taking action. So anyway, let's open it up to the very distinguished audiences, and if you can please just identify yourself first, and then the question can be directed towards any particular member of the panel or towards the panel in general. The gentleman back there.
Alexei Savchenko, I represent here myself. I have a question to everybody, but mostly to Mr. Parker. And as you said, you found the Achilles heel in the Putin's regime, which is the access to the Western shopping, access to the Western banks, and access to the joys of traveling to the West. Don't you think that if the United States, by chance, and Europe would manage to agree to introduce a visa ban on 1,000 top Russian executives and oligarchs, they would strangle Putin with their own hands, and we would get rid of this nuisance forever.
Well, I'd hesitate to predict what would happen, but I think it would be powerful, particularly if it was coordinated with the EU. And that's a key point here. And it's also something that's underway. There's been I don't know. Last I checked, 15 national parliaments that had explored this and had been pushing their governments to do this. Some further along than others, mostly in Europe, Canada, other places. But yeah, it would be powerful. And I think the hope behind the approach is that you should face the music at home, right? If you're going to spoil your own judiciary and your own system, when the music stops, you should have, you shouldn't be afforded the protection of the rule of law when you've so trashed it in your own country. And the hope is that if there's a serious threat of that, then perhaps some of these elite will be more serious about pushing these reforms. Again, exactly how that works out, it's hard to say. And some of it, of course, is also psychological. The fact that this is being done, and that's not to be underestimated.
Doug Feith, I'm a fellow here at Hudson. Thank you for the extremely interesting presentations. A few quick questions. One is, could you explain the mechanism of the act? I mean, how does it work? How does somebody get on the list? Secondly, what is the attitude of the key elements of the U.S. government toward the legislation? Because traditionally, whether it's a Republican or a Democratic government, the bureaucracy, the national security bureaucracy, does not smile generally on efforts of this kind. And so I'd be interested to hear what the attitudes are. And then related to that is, what's your evaluation of how the government apparatus has dealt with the existing legislation? I mean, how much use of it have they made?
Who wants to take that?
Mechanics?
Which part would I take?
Mechanics?
Yeah.
I'll
Well,
go
the
with smiling.
The smiling, okay. The smiling part. Yeah, so the mechanics, the mechanism envisages that the administration will be doing most of this, that they don't need to wait to hear from Congress or from human rights groups. And this is partly informed that, we built this thing over 2 Congresses. So, if we had to, completely start it from scratch, it might look a little bit different. But as we move along in this dance with the Russian opposition, in the particular context of the Magnitsky Act, and the administration, we're refining it and adding things in and trying to make sure that loopholes aren't used as we've seen them used in other human rights legislation. The one I would point out specifically is, I believe, the Burmese Democracy Act, I think of 2003, and the Burmese Jade Act that called for public lists that we never saw any public lists. So we would constantly hear from the administration, and again, it's any administration. This is not an approach that comes easy to an administration, and it's certainly not an approach that comes easy to foreign ministries around the world. But the idea is, they continue to tell us that, you don't really need to do this. This is redundant to what we're already doing. So fine, if it's redundant to what you're already doing, then just sort of do what you're already doing and tell people you're doing it. Isn't that really what the act is? The act says that it doesn't send the U.S. government on a worldwide investigation and manhunt and looking under bushes and expending all these resources to find out about what crimes are going on. We have consular lookout, databases. We have posts that write human rights reports every year under mandate from Congress. We already know a lot about what's going on, and we know some of the most egregious cases. And the administration had told us, we've been trying to do something like this for 2 successive administrations, just haven't gotten to it ourselves. And we've seen other parts of it, Samantha Power's Presidential Study Directive 10, the atrocities order, tried to get at this a little bit, but then it falls off the map without that congressional oversight. And that's where there's another mechanism in the legislation where Congress, select members of Congress on a bipartisan basis, can submit names and request a determination. Congress is not listing these individuals, it's asking for determination in a specific framework. But the idea is that the president makes a determination. Now, in the Magnitsky Act, the president delegated his authority to the secretaries of State and Treasury. So State and Treasury make a determination using the criteria in the Act as to who meets this, and then subject them to a dual sanction, a visa ban and an asset freeze. And of course, that requires it to be public, so essentially you get your public visa ban through the asset freeze, because asset freezes can't be done. I mean, the banking sector freezes assets. Of course, there's classified annex provision. There's waiver authority in that regard. But I hope that explains the mechanics a little bit. In reality, the way we've seen it work is that the State Department, various posts, DRL working with consular affairs and regional, well, in this case EUR, in a global Magnitsky would be all the regional bureaus, work up a list. And then they basically send that list to Treasury, and Treasury thins it out, right? How many of these people can we produce evidentiary packages on, targeting packages? And then the NSC has full control over, flipping the switch and lighting up Treasury's SDN list, which is what causes it all to be public.
And it's a pretty high standard. I mean, the Treasury requirements are, sometimes frustrate us because of what the evidence requirements are. We think that there's more evidence on some individuals, than meet what Treasury standards are. But look, I think it's fair to say that it doesn't matter who's in the White House. I don't think that presidents or administrations usually appreciate Congress doing anything. Or certainly requiring them to do anything, and it was kind of puzzling. I mean, this wasn't something that the administration was cheering us on to get done, and we can't wait to sign it. It wasn't one of those types of things. It was, a lot of skepticism, and even on one of the things that complicated things. And resulted in kind of narrowing it to Russia instead of global, was the administration said, the cost of this would be, more than we can deal with right now. Notwithstanding the fact, as Cal mentioned, they do country reports, they do human rights reporting all the time, they gather information on people all the time, but nonetheless, they were saying it was going to be a cost, and that complicated things, in terms of, House passage of it, and so we had to narrow it down. But since it's been in effect, there are 28 names.
34.
34 names, and I will be honest with you. I think they've been too careful. Careful is the wrong word. Too timid, I think, is the better word. And I think, and I expected a more, but nonetheless, 34 names. Would not, these 34 names would not be on any list if it wasn't for this bill. And it gives us an opportunity to engage the administration on a regular basis, and press them, and to have them focus on these things. And so they are putting people on the list. I go back to where I began. I don't think there would be any consequence for any of these 34 people had it not been for this bill, and because it's forcing the administration's hand. And I think the same would be true with the global Magnitsky. It would give us an opportunity to engage them, and to push them toward a result that we think is just.
Mm-hmm. Thomas, the gentleman in front in the purple tie.
I'm Raymond Baker, Global Financial Integrity. First of all, a question for the Congressman. How do we keep this from being completely politically applied? I've watched anti-corruption agencies and financial intelligence units all over the world apply their efforts for political ends. Even here in the United States, the denial of visas to people who are suspected of kleptocracy, that information isn't widely available, but appears to have been fairly selectively applied. Is that something we should worry about, the selective application of it, or not? And then secondly, a question for Bill Browder. Gun war. Sanctions against some of the leadership, the directors of gun war. Putin and his immediate and richest colleagues. Have sanctions affected them at all yet?
even the World Bank is estimating that Russia will return from deficit GDP performance to at least zero growth in the year 2016. That doesn't indicate that what we've done so far has had any particular impact on the leadership. Is that right or not right?
So, in terms of whether you should be worried about whether this becomes politicized and is not kind of implemented in the way that we all envision it to be, look, I think with any law, you worry about that. You want it to be implemented objectively and fairly, and I think that's a job for Congress to make sure that this doesn't become we're only going to go after bad guys in countries that we don't have economic relations with, or we don't like, or whatever we have a problem with. I mean, you want this to be done. You want this to be done in a way that has integrity. And I guess if one of the good things about kind of the administration making the standard high to kind of get people onto this list is that people have to work really hard to be really bad to kind of make that cut, and there has to be lots of evidence available. But I think I'm counting on people doing proper oversight over the implementation, and I'm counting on people like you, to keep this administration and future administrations' feet to the fire, that they're doing this in a way that maintains integrity. If it becomes a political list, then it loses its impact. If it looks like this is just a political vendetta, then I think it becomes less effective. But right now, I think people who are getting on this list, realize that they're being shamed, and that there is a consequence. And I think people are afraid to get on this list.
Yep.
And so I think it's, thus far, I think it is having an impact. And, and again, I got some other people I would like to be on that list, but, but they got to meet this standard. And we got to make sure that this, like any other law that we pass, is implemented in the way we intend it to be.
To answer your question quickly about are sanctions working, the main sanction, which is devastating for Russia, is what's called sectoral sanctions. There's two types of sanctions. There's individual targeted sanctions, and then there are sectoral sanctions. Sectoral sanctions forbid Westerners, U.S. and Europeans, from lending money to certain Russian companies for longer than 3 months, which have effectively dried up the capital markets for all Russian companies. And what that means is that Russian companies currently owe $630 billion in hard currency to Western creditors. And they can no longer, every time a bond or a bank loan comes due, historically they could go and refinance those in the West. Now all of a sudden they can't, so they have to say, who's going to lend that money? Well, the Chinese aren't going to lend the money, I can tell you that. And nobody in Russia wants to lend the money because they're all trying to get their money out of Russia and into safe places where their money is not going to be at risk. And so the only lender in Russia is the lender of last resort, which is the Central Bank of Russia. And the central bank only has 370 billion of hard currency reserves. And so what's going to happen is sometime over the next year and a half or 2 years, the central bank reserves are going to be run down, and at the same time, a lot of companies that aren't considered to be strategic are going to go bankrupt. And I don't know where the World Bank is getting their prediction that GDP is going to be fine. Maybe GDP in ruble terms, 50% down is going to be fine, but the Russian economy is going into a major crisis right now. Oil prices, sanctions, and the only way it's not going to be in a crisis is if oil prices surprisingly go back up a lot, or if we lose our nerve on those sectoral sanctions. And I don't believe either is going to happen. And so I think that it's a waiting. We're playing chicken with Vladimir Putin right now, and he's trying to pretend that nothing is bothering him, but he's scared to death because if he runs out of money, that's why the Soviet Union fell apart, was because they ran out of money.
Thomas?
Image, thanks.
Tom Firestone from Baker McKenzie. I had a question for you about the global Magnitsky list. And are you at all, is there a danger, following up on the previous question, that maybe you're setting off a process that's going to be uncontrollable and that other countries are now going to start retaliating with similar lists against the U.S., congressmen, business people, and that don't have the controls that you've all spoken about in the Treasury Department and the high evidentiary standards, and this can be used by other, maybe not in the U.S., but by other countries as a political vendetta, retaliation. We're going to have every country banning everybody else publicly, freezing their assets, and then we're just going to get to a point where it's unworkable, and everyone will have an international agreement not to use this as a political instrument. Are you worried that it could go that way?
Can I just, my friend Tom, who's just asked the question, and I both were arbitrarily banned by Russia without this type of stuff, and so. It's an issue. But no, people do it anyways. People do it anyways. I mean, people banning people left, right, and center all the time. Anyone they don't like. I've got many friends who are journalists who can't go to China because China doesn't like certain journalists. Many friends who are banned from Russia. It happens anyways. But what the important thing is that if important countries, if the United States and if the G7, not the G8, starts using this as a pedestrian tool, not a high-profile tool, but it becomes just a pedestrian thing where bad guys just can't travel anymore. It's not even a part of international relations anymore. It's a part of judicial enforcement that bad guys can't travel. I think it'll have a dramatic effect. I think right now there is no deterrent for being bad. There's no consequence. If all of a sudden you create a consequence where bad guys have to worry, and if it becomes a pedestrian thing where they think, oh my God, if I go into the Interior Ministry and do torture as a career, I'm not going to be able to leave Uzbekistan anymore or wherever. Then it's not that changes the whole. Everybody evaluates activities on the basis of costs and benefits, of risk and reward. If you create a risk for them doing that, then that's a really a very strong thing. Will third world countries use this arbitrarily? Maybe they will, but they already do. But the only question is, will civilized countries use this arbitrarily? And I don't think so.
The woman in the yellow sweater. Yeah. Oh, you got one there.
Thank you all very much. I very much enjoyed your conversation. The question is for...
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, forgive me. My name is Conchita Sarnoff. I'm the Executive Director of Alliance to Rescue Victims of Trafficking, which is a DC foundation to help rescue and rehabilitate trafficked children. As you might know, there are over 22.7 million children being trafficked across the world. And according to the latest figures, over 1 million children are being trafficked into the United States. Some of these children are coming in from Russia, from Ukraine, certainly from Mexico, and according to various reports, the Russian, Ukrainian, Mexican, and Colombian cartels are the biggest culprits. How would you suggest that the cartel leaders and those who manage the trafficking of children, which is a global network, how would you suggest that the United States penalize the cartel leaders and put visa bans and et cetera and everything you've been speaking about? Because clearly this is an issue that continues to grow and we don't seem to have a handle on it at all. Thank you.
What do you suggest? No, I mean, because I mean, a lot of the things that we kind of are putting into this bill. I mean, the administration has the ability now to do some of this stuff. We've done a lot of hearings on trafficking, and it's a horrendous problem, and trying to figure out how to do things beyond what we're doing now, to think more imaginatively about how you can stem this. And hold those who are responsible to some account. I mean, is difficult. Is difficult. But I mean, maybe this is for a further conversation offline. But I mean, I'd be interested in, in trying to figure out, some out of the box new ways to approach this. Yeah. And can I just say one thing before too? I've been banned from going to certain countries. I haven't tried to go to Russia yet, but. But but I've been denied visas to Bahrain and to Sudan, and I go right down a list of countries. And diplomats and politicians and citizens get routinely denied access to Tibet. Yet when Chinese officials come to the United States, oftentimes there are no restrictions of where they can travel. So people are doing, they are denying us access to places because they don't like what we say about human rights or about corruption. I guess my point would be, if we don't kind of go down this road, and again, this is basically, very careful, targeted sanctions against individuals, that we have evidence to show that they're involved in these bad things. If we don't, if we don't have like a Magnitsky Act, then what is the alternative? We just continue to kind of go along as we've been going along, and I think people sometimes do these things because they can get away with them. There's no consequence. There's no consequence to anybody in Bahrain for denying me a visa. I mean, yeah, so the State Department says they sent a letter saying that's not a good thing, but who cares? I mean, that there's no, or if I can't travel to Tibet, there's no consequence for the Chinese government for that. We are actually incredibly generous to people from some of these countries where that have terrible human rights records, and then we allow them to come to this country. And I don't want this to turn into something that's out of control, and that's why this has to be carefully managed, and we have to maintain the integrity. But I think you can do that if the desire and the will is there to do this right, and I think it is. Then I think this could be an effective tool, and I don't think it's going to be used indiscriminately, and tens of thousands of people are going to be on the list if it goes global. I think it's going to be used very, very carefully, and I think if it is and done properly, it will be effective.
Is there any mechanism for a person who's put on the list to defend himself?
I'll take that.
I guess what I would say on that is that it's complicated, right? So for visas, there is no due process that's afforded. And certainly we don't aim to build any in or completely reimagine the Immigration Nationality Act. On the asset freezes can be challenged in court. It's a high bar to meet. But what I would say is that what's happening and the mechanisms that are available are all of those that are already available under all of our sanctions programs anyway, and that are in laws like the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is the overarching law that America uses, and the Magnitsky Act taps to do the sanctioning during peacetime, right? I mean, it's the law that the president uses that in the case of the Ukraine-specific executive orders by invoking the powers and the authorities of IEPA to do this. So in that sense, these folks are in the same category as drug kingpins and terrorists and others. So we're doing this anyway, and I think one point that goes to the heart of what you're doing, Charles, at the Kleptocracy Institute is: do we really believe that human rights is a national security issue? Do we really believe that corruption and the collapse of the rule of law is a hard national security issue? If we do, then this is no different than what we already do by doing this with drug kingpins, organized crime, terrorists, and others. But I suspect that that's still an argument. We need to do a better job selling and explaining about that. I mean, I think when I look at the conflict in Ukraine, I see very clearly, and it looks to me like, the utter collapse of the rule of law in Russia, something that we might have seen as a soft values basket issue, has led to a shooting war in Europe. I think if we see it in that context, then it's obvious. We use the tools we have. We use the tools with traffickers. And one thing on the trafficking question, and you had an op-ed in the Post recently, right, about the collapse of the trafficking deal. Great piece. With Congressman Smith on the case, you could be assured that if there's an angle to use this with trafficking, that will be, Mr. Smith as the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act.
Mark Lagon, the new president of Freedom House.
I guess I don't have to introduce myself. One of the beauties of this legislation is it connects the two problems of human rights and corruption, as you say, Kyle. My question is for Charles. Can you explain a little bit about, if to show why you'd need the global instrument, you'd need to look at some other cases besides the flagrant case in Russia. Could you just talk a little bit more about corruption cases elsewhere that might be, a reason for using this legislation? I gather one of the premises of your initiative is that corruption kind of taints us here in the United States.
Well, actually, I think you would, and Freedom House would provide the names much better than I would. I mean, one way to answer that question is, what on earth is the Kleptocracy Initiative having to do with this? Because we don't give a hoot about human rights and freedom and all of that stuff. At least, I don't when I'm wearing my Kleptocracy Initiative hat, right? But what we find is that it's the same, these people whom we would want to sanction under Magnitsky or Global Magnitsky are almost invariably kleptocrats, and so they join together. So I guess we do get to this rather simple world of Bill Browders where there are good guys and there are bad guys, and so that we can get at them from one angle or another. But I also think, just adding to Mark's question, I do think, to sell Global Magnitsky, I think it's great that Magnitsky is still kind of the lead case, but I would think it would be good to have a bunch of other cases. Perhaps Freedom House could come up with some really salient case studies that would support the passage of Global Magnitsky.
Freedom House, two Magnitsky events on the Hill this week, and at both your executive vice president, Daniel Kalengard, had a pretty good list. I think eight or nine individuals. The ones I don't think he mentioned Cao Shunli, China case that I don't cover China, but her case has been written up and described as ripe for targeting in this respect. Two cases I am familiar with: Azerbaijan, Rasul Jafarov, Khadija Ismailova, RFE reporter, in jail for her investigatory reporting around the corruption at the very top of Azerbaijan's government.
Thomas? The lady in front there.
Hello, I'm Eleanor Bachrach. I've worked for USAID in Ukraine and other places that have suffered from kleptocracy. I realize that you can't or don't, these acts don't extend to heads of state who may well be the worst guys. I don't know how far down does that go in terms of untouchable government officials. And I'd also like to know a little more about what progress on this in other desirable countries like the UK.
So in theory, the act applies to everybody. There's no reason why it doesn't apply to a head of state. The definition is if somebody has perpetrated gross human rights abuses, then they're subject to this act. And I think the definition in the Global Magnitsky Act is even more well defined. So it includes command responsibility, meaning so in theory a head of state could be sanctioned. Now there's also a provision of the act which allows executive privilege, or so the president
waiver authority
can say, no, we're not going to do this because this violates our national security concerns, or the president can say, we're not going to do this publicly, but we'll do this confidentially. And these were all things that we fought over, how you divided those things up. In Russia, we do have now the what's the highest level person in Russia? The deputy
interior minister.
The deputy interior minister and the deputy general prosecutor of Russia, who are people who might be considered untouchable, are on this list, which is not the interior minister or the general prosecutor, but one level down, which is not disastrous. And the last part of your question was
progress in other countries.
Progress in other countries, which is what I'm working on. So the most probable other country in the short term, in the very short term, is Canada. The Canadian, I was just in Ottawa, and we have some friends here in the audience who are also up there with me, who and the Canadian government has indicated The Canadian Parliament has done the same thing that the U.S. Congress did. It's a different structure of governance, and so the Parliament can't force a law. They can only recommend a law, but it was unanimously recommended by all parties, including the government party in Canada, to adopt the Magnitsky Act, and the government has indicated that they're now in the process of putting together a piece of legislation that they would vote for and put in place. Now, anything could derail that, it's like herding cats to make anything happen in any political system, but I'm pretty optimistic that something will happen in Canada. The European Parliament, again, has called unanimously on the European Union to do the same thing. The European Union, again, the European Parliament doesn't have the capacity to force the European Union to do it, and so it's a country-by-country story, and it's tougher in Europe than it is elsewhere because there's more money, more Russian money in Europe.
Well, I'm afraid we have to stop here because we've run over already. Bill's book is for sale at the back of the room, I think. Is it still for sale? Yes. It is.
Yeah,
So
I'd be happy to sign a book for anyone who buys one. So.
yeah. And thank you all for coming.